There is no one else quite like our guest tonight, David Brooks. He occupies an entirely unique position in our culture. He seems to have become our national moral compass. In his work as a writer and commentator for the Wall Street Journal, NPR, PBS NewsHour, and of course the New York Times, his career has been dedicated not to spouting opinion, but to creating dialogue. More than once, reading his column, I've slammed my laptop down in fury. Other times, I've found myself audibly, along. Brooks encourages his readers to think, not along party or ideological lines, but to form their own conclusions and to challenge themselves every single Tuesday and Friday. In David's previous books, Bobos in Paradise, The Road to Paradise, and The Social Animal, he examined the radically shifting attitudes towards consumerism and social communication. In his new book, The Road to Character, he delves much deeper, examining the essential experiences, actions, and qualities that define us as moral beings. It is his most personal work to date and shows Brooks' evolution as a writer and a thinker, and as a voice for our times. Please help me welcome to Sixth and I, David Brooks.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, in part because Politics and Prose is my bookstore, my local bookstore. So every dollar you give to me tonight will be going straight back to Politics and Prose. And second, it's a weird route back here for me. I grew up in New York in a place called Stuyvesant Town, what I call, if you know it, I call it Singapore on 14th Street. It's a project with a lot of rules. I grew up to parents who were somewhat left-wing. In 1965, they took me to a be-in. A be-in was where hippies would go just to be. And then so what they did was they took their wallets and they set a garbage can on fire and they threw their wallets into it to demonstrate how little they cared about money and material things. And I was 5 years old and I saw a $5 bill on fire, so I reached into the fire and I grabbed the money and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. It shifted that way. And so that was one little transition. The second was I was normally interested in baseball. I went to Grace Church School, which is right next to the Strand Bookstore in New York, if you know that. I was part of the all-Jewish boys davening choir at Grace. We would sing the hymns, but to square it with our religion, we wouldn't sing the word Jesus. And so the volume would drop down and then it would come back up. And so that was another shift back toward Sixth and I. And then I wanted to become a writer. At age 7, I was very lucky. I knew right away what I wanted to do. I read a Paddington the Bear book, and I wanted to become a writer. And since then, I've always known what I want to do of some form. I remember in high school, I wanted to date a girl named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. But people have different values. And the career went along. I went off to the University of Chicago, where fun goes to die. The better phrase about Chicago is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so I went there, got the little Great Books education, which fed into this book. Then I had a peripatetic career and wound up as sort of a conservative columnist at the New York Times, a job I likened to being chief rabbi at Mecca. And not always a lot of company there on the op-ed page, but people are friendly. And then, so that brought me back to Washington, the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. And eventually it brought me here. My first spot on this stage was, it was about 11 years ago. I'm sure many of you know the history of this building. It had been one of the original Adas Israel buildings, a synagogue. Then it became a Baptist church. And then when the Baptist church moved away, they were going to sell it and turn it into a nightclub. And Abe Poland, the guy who used to own the Washington Wizards, and some other affluent people, what we now call high net worth individuals, which we used to call rich, they bought it and they converted it into a synagogue. And the first service that was held in this building for 50 years was my son's bar mitzvah. And it was just, we booked it when it was still under construction. They got it done just in time. And there were 3 Torahs in there, which we think, if the attribution is correct, none of which had been used since the Holocaust, since World War II. And so the synagogue, the Torah that he read that day was something that had been rescued, we think, from Poland and not used. And then so he was the first person to have a Jewish service in this building in 50 years and the person to read a Torah in 50 years. So it was incredibly meaningful to be here. And then my daughter was also baptized on this stage. And so those are moments when you think back on the first time I was here, those are moments of sweetness. And life affords such moments occasionally. There was a moment that occurred to me with my kids about a year before my son's bar mitzvah. I was doing the News Hour. We do these segments on Friday nights with Mark Shields and I. It's called Shields and Brooks. We thought it should be called Brooks Shields. It would go better, but I was driving home, and it was summer, and so it was light out when I got home at about 7:20. And I pulled into my driveway in Bethesda, and my driveway went around our house and could see in the backyard. And my kids had gotten one of those balls you get in the Safeway, the Giants, and they were kicking it up in the air, and it was curving and arcing, and they were chasing it, and then rolling on top of each other and trying to grab the ball first. And the summer sun was coming through the trees, and the grass was just perfectly green, and the kids were running and frolicking and laughing. And I pull into the driveway, and I see this unexpected scene through the windshield. I sit there looking at the scene through the windshield. And it's one of those moments when time and life are suspended, when reality spills outside its boundaries, and you get a sense of being overwhelmed with gratitude for a pleasure that you have not earned. And we've all had these moments, some of them looking at our kids and the joy we get from kids. And that sense of getting something you haven't deserved elicits sometimes a strange stirring. It opens up a glimpse of a higher joy that's more pleasurable than anything you get in your career. It exposes your depths, your heart is sort of out there and exposed, and it calls forth a desire to be worthy of that kind of gift. And occasionally an experience like that, a bar mitzvah, or just an unexpected moment like that, will elicit this desire to be worthy. Sometimes just being in the presence of people who radiate an inner light elicits that desire. Last summer I was fortunate enough to be seated next to the Dalai Lama at a Washington think tank, and he's a guy who radiates just an inner light. He laughs at unexpected and inexplicable moments. So you'll just be sitting there with him and he'll start laughing. And you want to be polite, so you laugh back. And so you feel like you should insert a joke just so there can be some pretext for the laughter. But he doesn't really need it, he'll just laugh. But I was made so uncomfortable, I just kept saying weird things. He has a little canvas bag, a little Dalai Lama bag. And so I was trying to think of things to say, and I said, well, you got any candy in there? And so he pulls out stuff from the bag, and it's basically everything you get in the first-class cabin of an international flight. So it's like the little eye patches, the earplugs, little razor, toothbrush. He's pulling all this stuff out of there, and finally pulls out a big Toblerone bar. So he did have candy in there. But that sort of inner light does elicit a desire to be worthy of such people. I experienced it also I was up in Frederick, Maryland about a year ago, and I was visiting some people who teach immigrants first English and then how to read. And this process with adults can take up to 7 years. And so I walk into this room with about 35 ladies, mostly women, aged 50 to 70. And as soon as you walk in the room, you feel this sense of goodness, their patience, their glow, their settledness, their rootedness. They make you feel funny and more valued when you talk to them. They're not thinking about what good they're doing for the world with this work. They're just not thinking about themselves at all. And so that too elicits this desire to be worthy. This desire, and you think, and at least I thought at that moment, I've achieved more career success than certainly I ever imagined I would. But when I think of the glow that the Dalai Lama has and the inner glow those ladies in Frederick had, I realize I don't have that. And this is the only life you get. I'd like to try to get one of those. And so the way I began to think about it, and I've written about this now, is that there are two sorts of virtues, which I call the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. The resume virtues are the things you bring to the marketplace. Are you good at your job? Good at being a teacher, journalist, whatever it is. The eulogy virtues are the things they say about you after you're dead. Were you honorable? Were you courageous? Were you capable of great love? Did you generate the sort of inner light that will fill a church or a synagogue or a mosque on the day of your funeral? And we all know the eulogy virtues are more important, but we live in a city, and we have an educational system, and we have a culture that places a lot more emphasis on the resume virtues. And we're a lot of us, including me, I'm a lot clearer about how to build a great career than how to build a good inner character. And a book that helped me think about this was a book written in 1965 by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik called Lonely Man of Faith. And Soloveitchik said we have two sides of our nature, which he called Adam 1 and Adam 2. Adam 1 is the career-oriented, ambitious side of our nature, the resume side. Adam 1 wants to build, create, produce, and discover things. Adam 2 is the internal Adam, what he calls humble Adam. Adam 2 wants to embody certain moral qualities, wants to have a strong inner character that honors creation and one's own possibilities, wants to have a solid sense of right and wrong, not only to do good, but to be good. And so Soloveitchik says, well, Adam 1 wants to conquer the world. Adam 2 wants to obey a calling and serve the world. Adam 1 asks how things exist, or how things work. Adam 2 asks why things exist and what ultimately we're here for. Adam 1 wants to venture forth. Adam 2 wants to be anchored in home. And so Soloveitchik argues we have these two sides of our nature, and they're sometimes in confrontation with each other. Sometimes being a good person is good for your career, but sometimes integrity is not good for your career. I have a friend who hires a lot of people, and in his job interviews, he asks them, name a time you told the truth and it hurt you. And so I tell my students if they can fake that, they're okay. Sometimes telling the truth hurts you. Sometimes having integrity hurts you. And so sometimes these things are in confrontation. And I'd say the essence of the confrontation is that Adam 1, the Adam 1 side of our nature and the Adam 2 side of our nature operate by different logics. The Adam 1 side, the resume side, operates by an economic logic, which is straightforward. Input leads to output, effort leads to reward, practice makes perfect. Adam 2, the less familiar side of our nature that the culture does not encourage, works by a moral logic, which is an inverse logic. You have to give to receive. You have to surrender to something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. You have to conquer your desires to get what you crave. Success can lead to the greatest failure, which is pride. Failure can lead to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. In order to fulfill yourself, you have to forget yourself. In order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. Now, we live in a culture that nurtures Adam 1 and neglects Adam 2. We live in a society that's very competitive, and the competition demands all your time and attention just to make it into the right college and the right job. The noise of fast and shallow communications makes it harder to hear the soft, still, quiet voice of the depth. We live in a culture that encourages you to have a big me, a big self. The meritocracy wants you to be branding yourself, promoting yourself, writing cover letters and resumes. Social media wants you to broadcast yourself, create a little highlight reel of your life you put on Facebook to get likes. The moral culture teaches kids that how wonderful they are inside, that they have a golden figure inside themselves that they can trust, and that is really good. You look at the commencement speeches, all the cliches, follow your passion, be true to yourself, trust yourself. We tell our kids how great they are, and we tell people even of my generation how great they are, and of course we believe them. In 1950, the Gallup organization asked high school seniors, are you a very important person? And in 1950, 12% said yes, I'm very important. They asked the same question in 2005, and it wasn't 12%, it was 80% who said yes. Their psychologists have a thing called the narcissism test, where they read kids' statements, or they read people's statements, and they say, does this apply to you? Do you say this about yourself? And their statements like, I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. Somebody should write a biography about me. I like to look at my body. And so the median narcissism score has risen 30% in the last 20 years. And so there's been a rise of self-aggrandizement. With that has gone an incredible increase in the desire for fame. UCLA asked college freshmen what do they want out of life, what are their top 16 values, and it used to be developing a meaningful philosophy of life was number 1. That's now number 16. Financial security is now number 1, and fame is usually second or third. And so junior high school girls were asked, would you rather be a celebrity's personal assistant, like Justin Bieber's personal assistant, to be around fame, or president of Harvard. And of course, by 3-1, they said they'd rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. College students were asked, would you rather have a life that involved a lot of sex or a lot of fame? And by 2-1, they chose the life with fame. And so I go to colleges and I say, I'm on TV twice a week, I'm in a prominent newspaper, I'm sort of famous, go with the sex, it's better. But this is a shift in values. And along with the increased belief in self and increased competition for attention or for success has gone a diminishment of moral vocabulary. Christian Smith is a sociologist at Notre Dame who interviewed college students around the country and asked, name your last moral dilemma. 70% of them could not name a moral dilemma. They said, I pulled into a parking space, I didn't have any quarters. He would say, well, that's sort of a problem. It's not really a moral dilemma. And they just didn't have the vocabulary to express what a moral dilemma was. And it wasn't that they were bad. They're not. College students are wonderful. They just have not been given a moral vocabulary. Google Ngrams measure the words we use in our books, in our newspapers, in our magazines, and you can see usage patterns. Economic words have risen sharply in the last 40 years. The usage of moral words is down sharply. The word bravery over the last 50 years is down 66%, gratitude down 49%, humbleness down 52%, kindness down 56%. We're just talking about this stuff less. And so Adam 1 is triumphant. But if that's all you are, you turn into a shrewd animal, a crafty, self-preserving creature who's adept at playing a game and who turns life into a game. You lack a quality of inner depth. You lose the ability to speak with a sophisticated moral vocabulary. You suffer from an unconscious boredom, not really attached to highest moral purposes. And I certainly have found that's true in long periods of my life. That you receive the gifts that life can offer, but I found myself slipping into a self-satisfied moral mediocrity, grading myself on a forgiving curve. I didn't seem to be obviously hurting anybody else. People seemed to like me. But over time, there becomes a humiliating gap between your desired self and your actual self. You come to the realization you're not really deserving the sort of eulogy you'd want. You're not the sort of person who generates that kind of inner life because you're focusing on self and on profession. So I set out over 4 years to see if I could not, writing a book doesn't make you a better person, reading a book doesn't make you a better person. But it's designed to give you a roadmap, and it's designed to introduce you to people who did do it. And so I set out to find a group of people who did that, who moved from shallowness to depth, from egotism to humility, from narcissism to service. And the book is really a collection of friends. We all have friends we learn from who are alive. Those of us with a historical mindset also have friends who are dead, who we can be in conversation with. An assembly of friends who are judging you, who are inspiring you, setting standards, setting examples of how it's possible to live. And each of the friends in this book is supposed to illustrate a certain stop on the road to character, a certain common activity that leads people to their depths. The first friend is a woman named Ida Eisenhower. Ida was born in 1862 in Shenandoah, Virginia. Her mother died when she was 5. Her father died when she was 11. She became an indentured servant. One day, the family she was basically enslaved to went out, so she just walked away. And she walked to Staunton, Virginia. She got herself into and through high school. She decided to go to college, so she hitched on a wagon train, went to Kansas, found a university, and graduated from university in 4 years. It was in the late 1880s, a young girl all by herself. At college, she met a dour man named David Eisenhower and raised 6 sons with him, one of whom was named Dwight Eisenhower. When Dwight was 9, he wanted to go trick-or-treating, and Ida would not let him. She said he was too young. So Ike threw a temper tantrum and punched a tree in his front yard so badly he rubbed all the skin off his fingers. Ida sent him up to his room, let him cry for an hour, bound his wounds, and recited to him a verse. He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city. And 7 years later, when Eisenhower wrote his memoirs, he said that was the most important conversation of his life. And he said it was because his mom taught him that he had a weakness in himself, which was his temper. and that he was going to have to spend his lifetime combating that weakness. And that is the definition of humility. Humility is not thinking lowly of yourself. It's radical self-awareness from a position of other-centeredness. It's seeing yourself from afar, seeing your strength, and seeing your weakness. And Ida introduced into all her sons a sense of humility of their own weaknesses. And Eisenhower spent the rest of his life practicing self-defeat. We think of him as this garrulous country club kind of guy. But inside, during World War II and during his presidency, he was lying awake, insomnia, anxiety attacks, drinking, throat infections, spiking blood pressure. And yet he put on a front and a persona of optimism and cheerfulness because he knew he needed to do that to lead. And there was a whole series of exercises to make himself better than he naturally was. Some of them were really stupid. He was a hater. And so he would write the names of the people he hated over and over again on pieces of paper and rip them up and throw them in the garbage can. Thomas Merton once wrote that souls are like athletes. They need opponents worthy of them if they are to be tried and extended and pushed to the full extent of their powers. And Eisenhower found that in his temper, and he was made a very impressive person by defeating his weakest spot. And he learned that from Ida. The second friend is Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson was born in 1709 in England. He barely survived the ordeal of his birth. He was handed over to a wet nurse whose milk infected him with tuberculosis that made him permanently blind in one eye and deaf in one ear. He developed smallpox, which left him scarred all around. They performed surgery on his jaw, which left just a jarring gap in his face. They opened his arm to bleed him and left the wound open for 6 years. He developed what looks like Tourette syndrome and OCD. He was twisting his hands, rolling about. Eating around him was a challenge because he was spewing food everywhere. He went to Oxford and dropped out after a year. He founded a school, which became probably the most unsuccessful school in British history. Closed after a year. By age 30, his life, he wrote, was radically wretched, and he suffered. And so his life teaches us how to make use of suffering. Now, no one should welcome suffering, but sometimes suffering can be used to good. And most people we see who we say are people of great depth, they've endured a season of suffering and turned it to good. And Paul Tillich, the great theologian, says what suffering can do is that can introduce you to yourself and remind you you're not the person you thought you were. Tillich writes that what suffering does, it carves into what you thought was the basement of your soul and carves it open, revealing a cavity below, and then carves beneath that, revealing a cavity below, revealing a cavity below. It introduces yourself into the harshest possible way. And then after giving you radical self-awareness, it lifts you up into transcendence. It gives you, if you attach it to a broad narrative, a desire to serve. I have friends who are around this community who lost a son at age 6, and they didn't say, well, we lost a son because, and so we should go out and party a lot because we had 2 years of grief, we should be extra happy for the next 2. They created a foundation, the Hope for Henry Foundation, to turn their suffering into morality, into holiness. And so we plan for happiness when we look forward to our life, but if you ask somebody, what made you the person you are? They never say, oh, I had a vacation in Hawaii that was really awesome. No one ever says that. It's usually moments of suffering. We plan for happiness, but we're formed by suffering. And suffering was made the most of by Samuel Johnson. He went to London and he began writing. And his writing was an effort from a guy who could not control his body and could not control his mind just to tie himself down into the reality of the truth. He developed an insatiable curiosity. He was told that a stretch of river was very perilous and people were drowning in it, so he jumped into that stretch. He was told if you took 2 musket balls and put them into a pistol and fired it, the gun would explode. So he put 7 balls in the pistol and shot it into the wall. He started writing about all of his weaknesses. He wrote essays on sloth, envy, guilt, boredom, sorrow. And so he just wrote himself so he could have an understanding of the world and so he could grip reality and tie himself down. Sort of a rage for understanding. And in this process, he really did tie himself down and gave himself a great integrity. One biographer wrote that by middle age, the iron had entered his soul. He approached questions of human conduct in the light of a terrible experience which enabled him to penetrate into human motives with sureness and understanding. He was capable of great works of industry. It took 40 French scholars 50 years to write the first English dictionary. Johnson did it alone with 6 clerks in 8 years, the first English dictionary. He wrote these incredible gifts to his friends. He had a friend who got a law lectureship at Oxford, but unfortunately knew no law. And so Johnson said, well, I'll write your lectures for you. For free, he wrote 60 lectures stretching over 1,600 pages. He was a member of the most exclusive club in the world, probably, with Edmund Burke and Adam Smith and Joshua Reynolds. But at home, he took in stray human beings who had nowhere else to go. Former slaves, former prostitutes, former alcoholics, a doctor with no money. He had 10 or 13 people living with him all the time who had nowhere else to go, just impoverished people living in his home. And so by the time Boswell runs into him, there's a largeness to him and a character that just people were awed by. When he died, a colleague said, he has made a chasm which not only nothing can fill up, but which nothing has a tendency to fill up. Johnson is dead. Let us go with the next best thing. There is nobody. No man can be said to put you in the mind of Johnson. And so Johnson is an example of using suffering to good end, but also how intellectual effort can be character building, how the rage for understanding can be a moral exercise. The third character is Frances Perkins, who was the first woman in cabinet under FDR, Secretary of Labor. She grew up, went to Mount Holyoke in 1902. Mount Holyoke in those days was different than colleges today. Here are some of the rules that were in place at Mount Holyoke. Freshmen should keep a respectful silence in the presence of sophomores. Freshmen meeting a sophomore on campus should bow respectfully. No freshman shall wear a long skirt or hair high on head before the mid-year examinations. Trying to teach deference. Holyoke was mostly interested in teaching character. Perkins's worst subject was chemistry, so they made her major in chemistry, thinking if she could defeat her weakest subject, she could handle whatever threw at them. Holyoke also gave its young women a heroic sense of mission. The slogan was, go where no one wants to go, do what no one wants to do. So Holyoke sent young women in 1902, 1903, all around the world, to Tibet, to Africa, to Pakistan, to do acts of service. Somebody did a census of all the American female missionaries abroad in the 1920s, and about 25% of them were Holyoke grads. Just this fervor to serve. Perkins went to Chicago, served at a place called Hull House, settlement house joined by Jane Addams. Then she moved to New York. 1913, she's having tea on the north side of Washington Square Park, if you know the park. And she hears a commotion. She rushes outside. She looks down the block and sees a fire. She stumbled across a very famous fire, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She sees what she thinks are bundles of cloth being tossed out the windows. But it's not cloth, it's like 9/11. People are deciding to leap to their deaths as opposed to being burned to death. And she sees 53 people go over the side. She sees a young man helping the women, the seamstresses, over the windowsill and dropping them into space. He helps a second, a third, the fourth is his girlfriend. He kisses her, he lets her go, then he goes over the edge. And that was a pivotal moment in her life, what you might call the call within a call. There are certain moments when we all have careers, but we do it for money, we do it for a lot of things, and we're sort of committed to it. But there are certain moments when we've chosen our career and it gets purified by something magnetic that happens, where you quiet the self, you're not in it for the money anymore, you're in it to be an instrument for a cause. And that's what the fire was for Perkins. It purified her, and it hardened her. And it wasn't because, we tell students, graduating students, follow your passion. Look inside yourself and follow your passion. Well, 80% of students have no passion. They don't know what they're passionate about. And so we have an ethos, look inside yourself, the answers are inside. But Perkins didn't look inside herself for her passion. She looked outside. She didn't say, what do I want from life? She said, what is life asking of me? What problem is out there in this circumstance that's demanding my response? And it was that fire. And it was worker safety. And so after the fire, she was willing to work with anybody, compromise with anybody, do anything to advance the cause of worker safety and worker rights. She went up to Albany, and she she tried to lobby for worker safety legislation, but she was a young woman, 19, 20, 19 teens, and the guys won't take her seriously. So she keeps a folder at home called Notes on the Male Mind. And she says, they won't take me seriously as a young woman, but they will take me seriously if I act like their moms, because all men want to be loved by their moms. And so she dresses like an 80-year-old lady with a frumpy gray dress, pearls, tri-corner hat, old-fashioned hairstyle, gets the nickname Mama Perkins, and then becomes an amazing lobbyist and really gets amazing legislation passed, and then comes to work for Franklin Roosevelt and serves throughout his entire term, and really one of the founders of the New Deal. Social Security, she's primarily responsible for. The interesting paradox of her life, at the end of her life in her 80s, she's lonely, she has no money, she has to work, so she teaches at Cornell. And she's living alone, and a frat house invites her to live with them. And she's ecstatically delirious because finally she gets to live with people, she's lonely. And so she lives in a frat house, and the man she lives next to is a guy named Alan Bloom, who subsequently publishes The Closing of the American Mind. And the president of the frat house, who becomes the pallbearer at her funeral, is Paul Wolfowitz, who served as Secretary of Defense under Bush. Weird historical paradox. The fourth friend I'll mention is George Eliot, the great novelist. Eliot, so Perkins teaches us about vocation, about how it's formed and how it's developed, how to turn a career into calling. George Eliot, her mom was sick, and so she grew up with a voracious need for love. She could be counted on to be humiliating and embarrassing at every party if she was not the center of attention. She would fall for every guy she met because she needed love. Married, unmarried, short, tall, young, old. Typically, she'd fall for some guy. She'd dazzle him with her conversation. He'd get sort of interested in her, and then the guy's wife would kick her out of the house. And so it was a series of embarrassing adventures. By the time she's 20, she's really not impressive. She's priggish, self-righteous, needy, doing not much with her life. At 32, she falls for a guy named Herbert Spencer, a great philosopher, the first guy she's been with who's her intellectual equal. She writes him a letter at age 32, which is at once pathetic, but also impressive. The pathetic part is the beginning, where she's begging him to marry her. It's like, oh, marry me, marry me. You won't even notice me. I won't cause you any trouble. I'll just live off in the corner. And it's sad. And if you don't marry me, I'm going to die. The climactic flourish, though, is a difference. She writes at the end of this letter, I suppose no woman ever before wrote such a letter as this, but I am not ashamed, for I am conscious in the light of reason and true refinement that I am worthy of your respect and tenderness, whatever gross men or vulgar-minded women might think of me. And that's sort of her agency moment. There's a moment where you stop being blown about by others' opinions and you develop your own criteria, your own accurate knowledge of your own self-worth. I teach courses, and one term I had a colonel in the military, an Army guy, who'd served in Iraq. And during one of the terms of his 18 months of service in Iraq, he had a superior who was terrible, who gave him nothing but negative feedback. And he said, during that period, I had to come up with my own criteria of whether I was good or bad, and not rely on affirmation or criticism from outside. And I call the moment when you can do that maturity. And I've never met anybody under 30 who could do that, he said. That was sort of her moment, a moment when maturity came in. She understood what she was worth and what she wasn't worth. It didn't work out with Spencer, but it did work out with a guy named George Lewes. Lewes was another writer in London. He was legally married to another woman, but he was not actually married to her. She had moved away, she was living with another guy, she'd had 3 kids with this other guy. Nonetheless, they was legally married. If George Eliot moved in with Lewes, she would be legally, and in Victorian mores, an adulteress. She would be read out of society, she would lose all her friends, and she would lose her family, who would cut her off. So she had to decide, do I want society or do I want Lewes? She thought for about a week about it, and she decided on Lewes. She wrote, I've counted the cost of the step that I've taken, and I am prepared to bear without irritation or bitterness renunciation by all my friends. I am not mistaken in the person to whom I've attached myself. He is worthy of the sacrifice I've incurred, and my only anxiety is that he should be rightly judged. They went off to Europe. All hell broke loose back in London, but their marriage worked. And so what she teaches us is how love can be a moral occasion, morally solidifying and morally deepening. The first thing love does is it humbles us. When you're in love, you're not even in control of your own brain. Love is like an invading army you want to be conquered by. The second thing love does is it plows open hard ground, exposes tender vulnerabilities. The third thing it does is it decenters the self. You realize your true riches are not in yourself, they're in another. The fourth thing it does is it eliminates the distinction between giving and receiving. Montaigne wrote that when a friend gives a friend or a lover a gift, he gets more pleasure than the person receiving the gift, because their selves are fused. And this is all first love. This is the first idealistic burst of romantic love, the kind of love that Taylor Swift sings about. There's a second love, what the philosopher Roger Scruton calls a second love. And that's not that idealistic, it's not that romantic, it is not that poetic. But it's the kind that comes when you're a little older, as George Eliot and George Lewes were. And it's the kind that sometimes comes in marriage, when there's commitments, there's realism about yourself, there's realism about your partner. And it's more long-term. It's not as passionate, but it's more long-term. And this second love is very local and very particular and very realistic. My friend Leon Wieseltier, who lives here in town, captured this second love in a wedding toast that he gave some years ago. This kind of love, he wrote, is private and it is particular. Its object is the specificity of this man and that woman, the distinctiveness of this spirit and that flesh. This love prefers deep to wide and here to there, the grasp to the reach. When the day is done and the lights are out, there is only this other heart, this other mind, this other face, to assist in repelling one's demons or in greeting one's angels. It does not matter who the president is. When one consents to marry, one consents to be truly known, which is an ominous prospect. And so one bets on love to correct for the ordinariness of the impression and to call forth the forgiveness that will be required. Marriages are exposures. We may be heroes to our spouses, but we may not be idols. So George Eliot chose well. She had this kind of love with Lewes. They lived together for many years. A few years in, he said to her, you should try writing fiction, something she had never done. She came back a week later with a short story she had written. She read it aloud to him, and he was immediately crying because he understood her talent. And he understood immediately that her talent was far superior to his own. And he spent the rest of his career subordinating himself to her. And he became her editor, her agent, her publicist, her counselor. She was very sensitive to criticism, so he got up early in the morning and looked through all the newspapers for any mention of her, and if there was an article that mentioned her, he would cut it out so she wouldn't have to see it. And their love is measured in the inscriptions to the novels she wrote to him over the course of the next 20 years. Adam Bede was written in 1859. She wrote to him, "To my dear husband, George Henry Lewes, I gift the manuscript of a work which would never have been written but for the happiness which his love has brought to my life." Felix Holt in 1866, from George Eliot to her dear husband, this 13th year of their united life, in which the deepening sense of her own imperfectness has the consolation of their deepening love. Middle March 1872, to my dear husband George Henry Lewes in the 19th year of our blessed union. And so this kind of love can stabilize a life as it did her. It can also flow outward to other people. And one of her great gifts as a writer is her ability to enter the mind of even the most unattractive character and to feel what's going on there. And so she teaches that value. And so all of these characters sort of represent different stops along the way to a life that we would say is a life of depth. But together they stand for one counterculture which stands in opposition to the world we live in today. We live in a world which is pretty romantic about ourselves, where we tend to think we have a little golden figure inside. We're basically good inside. Follow your passion, be true to yourself. These characters lived in a different tradition, which was more realistic, and which you might call the crooked timber tradition, after Immanuel Kant's phrase, from the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing is ever made. And this tradition is based on the idea that we don't live for happiness. We're endowed with a moral imagination. We have a spiritual urge to make something meaningful in our life. And so we really live for holiness, even if it involves struggle and pain. We'd rather have a life of struggle and holiness than pleasure and happiness. Second, we're not purely good inside. We're divided creatures, both deeply broken and splendidly endowed. Third, the struggle against our own weakness and sin is the central drama of our life, not the external climb to success. Fourth, in this struggle, humility is the greatest virtue, this quality of honesty and self-awareness. In this struggle, pride is the greatest vice. Pride blinds you to your own weakness and your own self-deception. Sixth, character is built not in the confrontation against others, but in the confrontation against yourself, being better than you used to be. Seventh, no person can achieve self-mastery on his or her own. We all need redemptive assistance from outside. I used to think before I started the book that character was this little iron bit of willpower that we had inside, but nobody can beat self-deception and temptation on their own just through willpower. Character is the ability to make really strong commitments to things outside, the capacity for strong commitment. In the realm of the intellect, a person of character has firm convictions about fundamental truths. In the realm of emotion, she's embedded in unconditional loves. In the realm of action, she's committed to causes that can't be completed in a single lifetime. And so it's done together. There was a great loss in our culture when we eliminated the word sin. Sin is now used in the context of fattening desserts. And I see why we eliminated the word sin, because it sort of means depravity and darkness. But the nice thing about sin is the word sin, as a piece of vocabulary to understand what's going on, is it reminds us that life is a moral occasion, and it reminds us we're all in it together. A weakness is something you have individually, but a sin is something we all have. We all have overlapping sins, selfishness, self-centeredness, and so on. And the people who really achieve depth, they never finally defeat their own weakness, but they impressively make progress against it. The final friend I'll mention is Augustine, who was born in 354. And he was an ambitious and very smart young man who was like a Princeton grad or a Brookings fellow of our time. Very successful, very smart. He had a mom named Monica, who was the helicopter mom to beat all helicopter moms. Monica ran his childhood, wanted him to be with her all the time, wanted to tell him don't date her, date her. She wanted to control him. If he went off and joined a sect she didn't like, she excommunicated him. He escaped her by leaving Africa, going to Italy. As he escapes on the boat, she's on the shore screaming at him. She gets on the next boat, follows him to Italy. And so their whole life was one of intense love, but intense conflict, because she had this controlling love. Finally, when she's 56 and he's in his 30s, he's gone through his famous conversion, and she says to him, all I wanted all my life was you to be a certain sort of person, and a certain sort of Catholic, and you've become that. You are that kind of person. And so she basically says to him, my life here is done. My work is done. I'm ready to go. And in fact, she did die 9 days later. And he describes in the Confessions their final conversation, which he says was so sweet. They rose by the very highest delight of the earthly senses in the purest material light. Their conversation did by degrees pass through all things bodily, even the very heaven when the sun and the moon and the stars shine upon the earth. They came out of our own minds and went beyond them into the realm of pure spirit. And he describes this very sweet and loving and peaceful conversation. And then he has a long sentence, which is very hard to read, but it has one word repeated in it over and over again, and that word is hushed. And so he says, the sound of the air was hushed, the sound of the trees were hushed, the sound of the birds were hushed, the sound of our voices were hushed, the sound of our heartbeats was hushed, the sound of our souls was hushed. And you get this sense of great tranquility. And that's sort of the reward you get at the end of a strong Adam 2 life. Adam 1's ambitions are never satisfied. There's always something out there. But Adam 2 does have moments of great tranquility. and moments where the inner light really is generated, like the ladies in Frederick or the Dalai Lama. And so the subject of this book is really that other side of life, the non-political side, the non-ambition side, but the inner side. And believe me, I don't understand how characters develop, but these are some of the people who illustrate some steps along the way. And the nice thing is that no matter what stage in life you are, young, middle-aged, or old, there's always still a lot more work to be done on that side of life. And I believe that people get better at living. And the closer you get to the end, the more quickly that progress toward that inner light is possible. And ultimately, that's what leads to a satisfying life. So thanks very much. Now, I've left a few minutes for question and answer. There's 2 microphones. If anybody wants to ask me about Ted Cruz, I'm fine with that. Just don't ask me about the Torah portion I had to talk about last time I was up here. So. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm sure I speak for all of us. We just worship you and we listen to you every Friday night.
Here.
So, can I please ask, last week on Diane Rehm, you said 2 things that were just very on target, like most of the things you say, and one of them was about you're not nostalgic for the 1940s and 50s because life was harder then. And I was thinking when you said that, but people were more humble then and they were more satisfied. You also said that you met a woman who someone had, the one child had died in Afghanistan and the other one was sick, and the woman said to you, "Oh, I wish people would always ask me about the child from Afghanistan." And I'm terrible at speaking to people when something terrible happens. And you said she gave me a list of, things to say, and not to put you on the spot. Do you remember other things that she recommended, like when she told you, "Oh, always ask me about the child who died because I want to remember them and stuff"?
Well, 2 things. Her name was Mary Woodowus, and her daughter, Catherine Woodowus, lives up in the Shaw district. She was the one who was nearly killed in a bike accident. And there are 2 things, just to recount that story. Her daughter, Anna, her elder daughter, had died in a horse riding accident in Afghanistan. And the advice she gave me was, I always wondered, should I mention a dead child to a parent? And she said, people don't want to mention it because they think they'll remind me of Anna. But they have to realize Anna is always on my mind. So you should mention it, and if I feel like it, I'll talk about Anna. If I don't, I don't. But if you mention it, that gives me the occasion to mention it. And so she, when we were sitting there while she was nursing Catherine, her other daughter, who lives here, and we were sitting in their living room, and they went over all the things that one should do and one shouldn't do. I'll give you a précis of them, but because I am a columnist and I have no unexpressed thought, you can also Google David Brooks' The Art of Presence, which is a summary of what she told me, the column I wrote.
Wonderful.
But a few of the things are, just show up. Just be present. Second, don't compare. Don't say, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, you lost your daughter. I know what you're feeling like. My dog died 3 years ago." Don't say that. Do the practical, mundane things. The best thing she got when her daughter Catherine was really getting her face reconstructed was they needed a shower mat, and somebody rode their bike to Target and brought the shower mat. And that was like a great gift. And then she said there are 2 sorts of helpers she'd found, firemen and builders. The firemen come right after the crisis, and they're there in the first weeks. The builders are the people who come months later. And she says there's rarely a person who's in both categories. Anyway, but if you look at The Art of Presence, I summarized all that stuff.
Thank you so much. And you'll never tell us who you're going to vote for next year, will you? No.
I haven't done that either.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the sort of the data that you gathered supporting the idea of a trend towards self-aggrandizement in our society. And I know you warned us against getting political, so I hope you'll excuse. You're a pundit, so
Go ahead. That's what I do.
Right. So I'm just wondering, it's tempting to think that this trend, sort of a character trend, societal trend, cultural trend, has something to do with the difficulty in reaching political compromise now. Is that entirely too simplistic, or do you see any value in following that idea a little bit?
I think there's an element of that. I think if you think most of politics is a competition between partial truths, and if you consider the possibility that you could be wrong, then the people who disagree with you probably have a piece of the truth or maybe a majority of the truth. But if you are filled with ego and you think you have the truth by the short hairs, then the people who disagree with you are just in the way. And so I do think there's a potential link between the size of egotism and the size of polarization. And it's probably not an accident that Rush Limbaugh's two shticks are great ego and his own magnificence and complete sureness about his opinions and polarization. So I do think modesty is not being a moderate is not being mushy in the middle. It's recognizing that politician is a competition between half-truths and that therefore the polarization is unwarranted. Thank you.
In The Social Animal, you have this character, Erica, who grows up in sort of a troubled neighborhood, finds a different environment, and that environment changes her, and then sets the course for the rest of her life. And you sort of see this trend occur, I guess, with some of the people you touched on today. What environments would you say that are available to the general population exist for things like building character?
Yeah.
It's a very open-ended question.
Right.
But.
Well, the two things. One, in that book, she lives in a disorganized neighborhood, and she finds what's basically a KIPP school, which gives structure to her life. John Bowlesby, the great attachment theorist, said all of life is a series of explorations from a secure base. And so what she needed in her life was emotional security and attachment. And that's true of a lot of people who live in poverty and in insecure systems. And so she has to move. She moves into a school. They give her structure, and she can have a decent life. And the counterculture required here, I think what's necessary is to find a counterculture where humility rules and where there is a moral vocabulary, where people discuss things, where there are certain activities that a lot of the characters in my book do, which are not part of our mainstream culture. They journal. I've become a big fan of journaling. They write down, what is my core sin? How does that core sin yield behavior I'm not ashamed of? There's somebody else in the book, his problem was he was hard of heart. People would come to him with problems, and he just wasn't present for them. He was thinking about his next meeting, or how he could say something clever at the meeting instead of listening to somebody else. And so at night, he would just review the day and said, what are the occasions when I was hard of heart today, and how can I do a little better tomorrow? And then some of it is just having a discussion group with friends. How do you make use of suffering? How do you make use of love? And so that's just getting out of the mainstream competitive culture and into countercultures where moral discussion is the norm. In the 1950s, moral discussion really was part of the common culture. Abraham Joshua Heschel, Martin Buber, Reinhold Niebuhr. Now we just have a bunch of politicized people. And so, but there must be writers who think about that stuff. Keeping a book list going of spiritual writing of any sort seems to me also part of it. But stepping outside the mainstream culture is the first step.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Building off what you just said, are there limitations to the Washington D.C. centric mindset that public policy and politics and economics can really shape character? And is the centralization of power in D.C. a symptom or a cause of the erosion of character that you discussed in your book?
Well, I would say three things. First, one of the heroes I mentioned to you, Samuel Johnson, had a couplet of all the things that human hearts endure, how few are those that kings can cause and cure. And what he meant by that is most of the things we care about in our life are not reachable by politics. It's about our relationships, our community, and our ideas, our philosophies. So to carve out a space that politics doesn't touch is important. Second, Washington, as I sort of joked, is the most emotionally avoidant city on earth. If you go to a congressional hearing and you use the word love, they look at you like you're Oprah. And economics has become the gateway between all of human knowledge and public policy. And economics is fine, but it's pretty limited. And so I do think it is a problem that we reduce everything to data. There's a lot of things that are just not measurable in data. And then the final thing about politics, as we observe it in this city, is we're surrounded by politicians whose job it is to market themselves all the time. And one of the things I find they lose, I spend a lot of time with politicians, and I generally like them, they're good people. But if they spend so much time marketing themselves as their own product that they lose an honest internal voice inside. That their public voice, what's good for them, becomes their voice. And they have no internal honest voice. It just gets bleached away. I remember John Hay, who was Abraham Lincoln's chief of staff, or one of his staffers, during the Civil War, he's writing press releases that say, you know, the North is winning, things are going great, General Meade, what a great general. But then he's writing a diary at the same time for himself. And it's like, we're losing, General Meade, what a schmuck. But that honest voice was there, and it's necessary. And I think there's a temptation in this city to lose it, because you're always just broadcasting the spin.
Hi. I want to know where you can buy humility pills wholesale for the good people of Washington, D.C. My question is, I want to thank you very much for starting this conversation, and I wonder what in you triggered you to start that conversation.
I'm glad you said it's a conversation. The book is like a very introductory venture into this turf. Yeah. And there are a lot of people, including a lot of people who like stand up here professionally, who do this for a living. But I just wanted to start that conversation. In my case, as I said, I didn't go through any midlife crisis or anything. I would have settled for the Corvette if I did. But I just, I do think we all have, John Stuart Mill said we all have a moral responsibility to be better every day. And you do want to get better at things. The obvious part of my life that needed to get better was the internal side. My career was fine. And I did find out, and I'm reminded of this yesterday, like as I said, I had achieved more career success than I ever thought I imagined. And you learn the fundamental truth that it really is not fulfilling. And sometimes the days, and I had a bad day yesterday, I might as well say this, why not? I shouldn't talk about myself in a book about humility, but I was going to call the book Humility, and it was going to be in small letters, Humility, David Brooks. But so yesterday at 5:10 p.m., I learned that the book is going to be #1 on the Times bestseller list. And I'll tell you, the reaction was just nothing. It's just like, it's a number. It just doesn't provide. And of course, all my life writing books, you think to get a #1 bestseller, boy, that's got to be a great day. It's just nothing. And I happen to be up in Toronto, where I spent my childhood, or at least up to age 4, when I immediately became an old fogey at age 5. And there was a kid there who I played with, who was, his dad worked at the University of Toronto, and they tied him in a harness to a pole. And he was on a rope, and I would play with him within the radius of that rope. And I imagined that I would slap him, and then I'd run outside the radius of the rope. But like the pleasure you get from being a kid and playing with your own kids is so much better than having a #1 bestseller. And that's just the elemental truth. And so the career really does not satisfy, and that was part of what I wrote for.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is sort of a follow-up to that question as well. As someone who is also passionate about the internal life, attachment, Bowlby, and all the rest of those guys, before this book, before Social Change, what was it that was going on inside you that drew you in? And maybe that's too personal. Maybe we can sit down for a week and a half and you can answer that question.
Yeah. I'll bring a couch out here and you guys can all have at it. But, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. You only realize what you're doing in your life until after you've already done it. And so I look at my books and each one covers the same ground, one level down. And so I wrote a piece for the Washington Post probably 15 years ago called The Republic of the Red Line. And it was about the Red Line metro area from DuPont Circle to Bethesda at each stop. And it was making fun of the culture of Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, sort of the progressive Northwest DC culture, these progressive grocery stores where all the cashiers look like they're online from Amnesty International. They all look like. And So it's that culture. And that culture, that piece for the Washington Post turned into a book called Bobos in Paradise, which was about consumerism. Then I wrote a book about patriotism. Then The Social Animal was about psychology and emotion. And this is about moral development. So it's the same upper middle class ground, one level down each time. So I don't know what I'm going to write about next, and maybe real estate, get down to the fundamental. But that's and you know, when you write books, for anybody who's writing a book, my one bit of advice is you only write the book if the writing of it justifies the work. I have a friend who had a book come out on 9/11, and that book just died. And so after you publish a book, you have no idea how it's going to be received or what's going to happen, but you got to write a book that solves some essential problem you're dealing with.
Yourself.
Yourself, yeah. Because and I tell you, you learn as being a newspaper columnist, you got to just explore what you're going to write the best column on whatever you're most passionate about at that moment. And I could pretend I'm really interested in some stupid issue having to do with Ted Cruz, but I'm just not interested. And if I tried to write about it, it would just be so flat. And so there is a little self-indulgence, and you just hope other people are interested in what you're interested in.
We are.
Well, if you're representative, then it works. If you're not, if you're too brilliant, then it doesn't work.
Hi. So I'm just going to caveat that with saying getting a PhD in clinical psychology. So how do you reconcile your writing of this book and kind of the attendant kind of recognition and approval that certainly comes with that, with your own kind of moral development? So obviously, I heard you on the Diane Rehm show, and on your reading your columns, and even being here today, you're engaging in some level of kind of self-promotion that may or may not negate, you know, ostensibly the deep kind of moral confrontation, you know, self-confrontation that you ostensibly engaged in order to even write this book. So I'm wondering if kind of pursuing one's, in building one's kind of career and resume virtues, is that necessarily orthogonal with the development of one's, you know, eulogy virtues?
Right. So, you know, I'm promoting myself in the cause of humility. It's like screwing for celibacy. It's like,
I'm glad you're not one of my patients.
I shouldn't say that up here. Spontaneous combustion about to happen. And so it's one. There are two words for that. The nice word is paradox. The less nice word is hypocrisy. But the only thing I'd say is, you know, I do want people to read the book, so I'm trying to talk about it. I've been struck in all the interviews how people want to talk about me. But the media is a very personal media. They want to know about people. And I have opened myself up for it. The only thing I'd say is each profession, whether it's the kind that puts you in front of a microphone or not, comes with its own attendant character challenges. Like, I am a pundit. I write in the book that I'm paid to be a narcissistic blowhard. I am paid to volley my opinions, to appear smarter than I am, better than I am. That's just my job. My job is to throw out opinions and generate reactions. And so the character challenge is you become too sure of yourself, you become too vain. But if you become a psychologist, there are character challenges involved in being a psychologist, and whether you're treating your patients after you really understand them or not. If you're a politician, there's character challenges there. If you're a cop, the small corruptions of petty authority. Each job has its own character challenges, and the only thing we can do is try to be aware of them and try not to succumb to them.
We have time for 2 more questions.
There were several letters to the editor in the paper that said that these conversations should be had in schools. And I'm here with a group of more than a dozen teachers and administrators from Washington Latin Public Charter School that teaches 5th grade through high school. And I'm just wondering what advice you have for those teachers. And I'm going to sit down because they're back there.
Okay. So there are 2 bits of advice I would give. I think there are not many ways to teach character. Most of the character curriculums that were developed a few years ago failed. But there are 2 ways to do it. One is with habits, the Aristotelian method, that if you get people in doing small acts of self-control, then that will lead to the action produces the virtue. And frankly, sports coaches often do that as well as anybody else. Small acts of self-discipline. The second, I've now come up with 3, so I'm entering into Rick Perry land. The second is what I try to do in this book, which is moral exemplars. And then if you give people examples of people they can imitate, then that warms the heart, and people try to be like those people, and we all have heroes. The third is what teachers do best, which is just being a certain sort of person. I don't know about you out there, I don't really remember a lot of what my teachers taught me, but I remember the sort of people my teachers were. And I wrote a column a few years ago about how hard it was to teach character in the classroom, and I got an email from a veterinarian named Dave Jolly, who lives out in Oregon. And here's what he wrote to me. He wrote to me that you're not going to be able to teach character to a bunch of students who are distracted by a million things. But then he wrote this: what a wise person teaches is the smallest part of what they give. The totality of their life, of the way they go about it in the smallest detail, is what gets transmitted. Never forget that. The message is the person, perfected over lifetimes of effort that was set in motion by yet another wise person, hidden from the recipient in the dim mists of time. Life is much bigger than we think, cause and effect intertwined in a vast moral structure that keeps pushing us to do better, become better, even when we dwell in the most painful and confused darkness. And the 2 phrases I really liked were, what a wise person teaches is the smallest part of what they give, and the message is the person. And so I'm not Catholic, I don't know what Pope Francis has done to Catholic theology, but when I look at him, I see somebody who communicates by his person. The message is the person. And so for teachers, the way they are and the way they treat people in the small acts, seems to me that's what gets communicated through teaching. And the only thing I would say is that opening oneself up to one's students is the way to let them into the life. I teach at Yale. I only teach at colleges I couldn't have gotten into. And I take my students drinking from 9:30 to 1 every Monday morning, or night and morning. And it's just a way of opening myself up. And believe me, I have more fun than they do. But it seems to me that breaking down some of the barriers between teachers and students is the key. Last question.
Maybe this is a generational question. I'm coming from Southern California, where the mantra pretty much is you're doing the best you can at every minute. So, it's a great excuse for never having to look at yourself, because whatever happens, you did the best you can. And I just don't believe that. So the conundrum is, and I think you talked about this a little bit in a column, and I wish you'd expand on it a little bit. What about judgment? What about standards? What about the bottom line, especially in certain kinds of behavior? And what about generational differences of what's fair?
Yeah. I guess in the book I have one chapter which has 2 essayists contrasted with one another, both of them great writers. Samuel Johnson, who was very earnest in improving himself with essays, and the French writer Montaigne, who was accepting of himself. If he had a flaw, he just said, well, I accept it, I'm fine. And so one of my students compared them to East Coast and West Coast rappers, where Johnson is very earnest and intense, and Montaigne is mellow and laid back. And you can choose which one you prefer. Believe me, they both have charms. I think I prefer the Johnson. I prefer the earnest intensity. And I do believe in a certain level of judgmentalism, as long as it's done from a position of humility. And I think the idea that everyone gets to live by their own inner light, and if it feels right for you, then that feels right for you, I think that does defeat any kind of moral discussion. There have to be a set of standards. And certain loves, we all love a lot of things, but certain loves are higher than others. And if you decide that laying on the beach is either your highest love in life, or a car is your highest love, or frankly food is your highest love, then I think we're allowed to think, that's fine, but that's really not a great life. And so we can elevate ourselves by not thinking anybody's really horrible, but their love is just not high enough. And I do think there are philosophers who do this, who help guide us. The final insult we've done to our kids is we've told them, come up with your own values, come up with your own philosophy. If your name is Aristotle, maybe you can do that. But for most people, that just means nothing. And so, I think what's valuable for people is to go back into history and look at all the ways our ancestors have given us moral traditions, whether it's the classical tradition based on honor and courage, the Jewish tradition based on obedience to law, the Christian tradition based on grace and redemption, the scientific tradition based on rational thought. There are all these gifts that have been given to us. I don't care which one people pick, but pick one and let that tradition set the standards for what's highest. And that involves a lot of trips to Politics and Prose to buy all those books. So, thank you very much.